Okay, I think we're live. Yeah, I meant to do this yesterday, Sunday, but time got away from me. Uh, let's cut to seeing me. Hi, what up? It's too high. There we go. Well, something like that. Yeah, so I'm gonna do another breakdown of a script of a project. This is gonna be where the Crawdads Sing, which I realized I did not load in the picture for, so that's fine. Whatever, we'll just go back to this. Yeah, so I'm gonna re-break Where the Crawdads Sing. I watched it yesterday. Actually, I liked it a lot. I thought it was pretty good. I think obviously the weak part of the movie, I can't speak towards the book, is definitely the romantic storyline. Because the court storyline that's sort of interwoven with the sort of here's the story of my life storyline, I actually think works fairly well. But the romantic part, you know, nobody's perfect. So I think that's probably what needs to be focused on. But let's go ahead and go through the whole thing first. I will say, just because I feel like I should, I made the mistake of googling the author of the novel, and yikes. Uh, from a making this movie point of view, um, maybe the people, maybe the producers that picked this project should have looked into the author a little bit more. But for the sake of what we're doing, I treat a movie, I treat a script for exactly what it is. I try not to contextualize it, but the fact that this one had such a interesting author story behind it is a little concerning. I'm not going to plant my flag other than I didn't realize this needed to be said, but if you're yeah, I'm not gonna speak to whether or not I think the author is guilty of anything or not, but I will say, um, as a writer, when you're writing, you don't need to write stuff phonetically, especially if it's a character whose race is going to be implied in how they speak. Um, I've come across this in workshops several times, and the answer is always the same, and everybody seems to agree on it. Don't write phonetics. If it's a black character and they speak in a black voice, leave that up to the writer, or leave that up to the actor that will be portraying that character. Write it like you if use the regular words you would. Like there's no it's just a very bad it's in very poor taste to write something phonetically, especially if it's in sort of if it's implying a race, a way of saying something in regards to race. It's bad news. That's all I'm gonna really say about that. Other than yeah, I boy do I regret looking up the author before doing this, because it did unfortunately recontextualize this entire project, as you do. So I'm gonna try to let that go though, and let's just address the show for what it is, or the movie. I am gonna use Dan Harmon's story wheel as I've done before. Let's see if I can pull it up too. This is this is a very common thing. Let me see if I can. Here it is. Yeah, so it's 8 beats, and the thing that I find that's so useful about Dan Harmon's story wheel is it's scalable and it's simple. The most important thing is that it's simple, and so there's no one size fits all for anything. Every project gets written differently, every story gets told differently, but in sort of the Western Hollywood understanding of how you tell a story, there's some very clear patterns, and I think using something like Dan Harmon's story wheel is a good way to sort of get the ball rolling. At least have the conversation to begin with. But I think it's a good litmus test for if something is paced incorrectly or if it's missing certain chunks. Just sort of grafting in Dan Harmon's story wheel, it does a pretty good job. So having said that, let's go ahead and cut back to this. Let me. I think I need a different color. What colors do I have? Blue, green, yellow, blue again, and then crazy colors. Uh, yeah, I'll do white, I guess. Um, yeah, so let's just go ahead and knock out Dan Harmon's story wheel. So blue one is you, which is zone of comfort. And obviously that's the beginning. So put it right there. Need, which is the character needs something. And let's just go ahead and see if we can do this in line. So, character in zone comfort, town talking, police, Kaya. So I think it's when Kaya gets busted, and then I think that makes sense. So when Kaya gets busted, that's sort of when everything starts. So let's go ahead and just do that. Five, six. Seven, 8, 10, 11, 12. Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So you need this. Go. So enter unfamiliar. I could have written this ahead of time, but for the sake of what we're doing, I don't think it matters. This is the go part of it. So let's put it right there. Search, which is 4. So enter in the unfamiliar and then search. So that's opening remarks, take the mission. Yeah, I think it's when Tate opens up to her, so we'll go ahead and do that. And 1, 3, just gotta go down. Okay. 24. Need to find better tape. I had really great tape that first time, and then since then it's been tearing the parts apart. 18, 19. Okay, so there's the search. Just make sure I'm still live. All right. So that was 4. So 5 is going to be find. Which again is just going to be right up here somewhere. 6 is going to be take, which is pay the price. Shows Chaser home. He's pushy. Red fibers. The letter back from the publishers. Nashville trip. I'd say it's probably if it's the court case or if it's the letter back. I'm gonna say it's gonna be the letter back. It's somewhere in here. We'll call it the ski cat. 30 to 46. One, 3, 35. Okay, that was take. And return is 7. Go back. Obviously, the top back 3. And the final of the story wheel is 8. Change now that you're capable of change. Let me just show you the story wheel one more time. While I do that. So it's you, need, go search, find, take, return, and change. We're just going to stuff changing somewhere in here. I think it's got to be when Jumpin' and her brother shows up, so we'll stuff it right there. So if you look at the right, I sort of stuffed it right there. So just to break it down, zone of comfort is basically finding out Chase is dead, and then sort of the very beginning of Kaya's story. The need, the want something is all of the young Kaya sort of flashback stuff. Go, which is all of Act 2, is this enter the unfamiliar. It's when Kaya is alone, when Pa abandons her, all the way to Tate sort of falling in love with her, basically. Search is adapting to this new situation where he's in love with her, all the way to he blows her off at the 4th of July. Find is so the 4th of July is sort of the midpoint, which I think that's correct. I think that's sort of the big formative moment where she changes from just sort of the innocent version of herself to a more jaded, cynical, that everybody leaves all of it. The second half of Act 2 is Find, so she gets over Tate all the way to this new guy Chase, and Chase basically like wedging himself into her life. Yeah. And then pay the price of what she found, which is this new guy, which is, again, the court, but also it ends with the low point, which is this whole time she realizes she thinks Chase is hiding her from everybody, and she finds out in public that he's been engaged this whole time, so it's been a whole sham. That's her low point, is realizing that she's been used again, and that he's basically been hiding her because that was the only way to have a relationship with her, because he was engaged the whole time, because he just is a bad person. And then Act 3, which is a lot of stuff happens, but it all happens really quickly, and so I've noticed that lately the Act 3 has a lot of beats because it has a lot of things it needs to clear up, but it goes quite quickly. This movie is no different. So Return, it starts with, her hiding from Chase as he's looking for her in light of getting exposed as basically a cheater, all the way to him trashing Kaya's home because she was hiding from him. And then the change is basically her sort of, oh man, I tagged myself, didn't I? Her exchange with Tate, but also all the court stuff, because obviously it comes back to the present, and so it sort of goes present, early life, which is, so present is always going to be blue, early life is always going to be green, and then we get present again, and then yellow is sort of her teenage through mid-20s, because I think it's about 10 years that goes by between her sort of meeting Tate as a teenager through knowing Chase as an adult, and then back to the present. So present, young, older, pretty much chronologically older, and then present again. That's kind of how I set it up. So let's just see how this is going. Okay. So that's what we're dealing with. So let's just go ahead and, for the next few minutes, probably 15 minutes, I'm going to walk through the note cards just to see how the scenes are sitting, but I'm fairly confident that there's not going to be any problems. So let's just go ahead and do it. I think what I can do is I can zoom in as we go. That will be what I do. Let's see here. Do they? Okay, so we'll start on the upper left because again, this is all set up. So this is Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, Act 3, and then this is just a slush pile in case I need to add cards at the end. It's basically 4 acts. Act 2 is a giant act. That's just how I was taught, but honestly, I think of it as 4 acts because I come from TV, and TV usually is an even number of acts, especially in comedy. That's not always the case, but that's just how I work. So Act 2 is basically 2 acts, with the midpoint being the bottom of Act 2A. So starting off, let's go ahead and look at the first batch of Act 1. So Chase is dead. That's the whole thing. That's how the story starts. I believe that's how the book starts. There's a dead body in the marsh, and he's like the quarterback, the captain of the football team kind of guy. He's the favorite son of the town. And then we have the town talking. I have a feeling in the book, but again, I haven't read the book, so you just got to treat the material for what it is. So I'm only going off of what I saw in the movie. I believe the town probably talks a lot more in the book than it does here, because it's really only to meet Tom, who's the lawyer, who's this older grizzled guy, and sort of the recurring thing there is he's always been kind to her because he's a kind spirit, and by the time he ends up defending her as her lawyer, he's a very old man. The police arrest Kaya, they go after her, they chase her, there's a big chase, she swims, they catch her in the boat, she's the marsh girl. And that's when Kaya meets Tom, and he introduces himself, and she goes, I kind of know who you are, and he goes, yeah, I kind of know who you are too. And then it sort of just jumps into flashback, and the rest of this act is all flashback. And so we meet young Kaya, and there is a huge amount of voiceover. It is what it is. So what's weird is because it's based on a book and because it's jumping back and forth in time, you got a few things here. The sort of view zone of comfort thing doesn't really happen. It just sort of establishes the town. So it doesn't really establish Kaya. And so the way it's told, it sort of implies that the town is the main character, but you find out very quickly that once you go into the need to want something, it's from the point of view of Kaya mostly, although there is points of view jumping, which I feel some kind of way about. There's certain stuff that is said about Kaya that she could not inherently know, even though she's the one narrating the story. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So yeah, let's go ahead and go into need, want something. It's basically just a voiceover. It's not really montage, but it's basically a narration of here's how I got to who I am. And she grew up in the marsh, and she had a family, and she had a mom, and she had older sisters and older brothers. And Pa is scary. She also meets young Tate. That's important because she meets Tate like 10 years later. It's still there. I don't know why 10 years had to pass. That was unclear to me. Maybe the book explained it, but again, you got to go with what the material you presented. Yeah, basically, Pa is a drunk, and Pa is scary, and Pa slaps Kaya for using his boat, I believe, and she falls into the water, and young Tate comes in and tackles him, and it's a whole thing. And when Pa's getting up, he straight up cold cocks Ma very hard, and that sort of, I thought that was going to be like a recurring thing. The way it was presented, it was going to be like, this is what family life is, but it seems like him punching Ma in that moment, that convinced her the next morning to leave, because the next thing is Ma leaves, which is a whole thing because Ma leaves even though there's this enormous family that she has. And again, she has 3 daughters and 2 sons, so she has 5 kids, the youngest of which is Kaya, the main character, who's like 6, 5, and the oldest, I believe, I don't even know their names, is like probably 15, but she just packs up and leaves. So that's interesting. I wish there was more time spent on exploring that. Maybe the book did, but again, you don't know. But it's a big deal. Ma leaves is a big deal for Kaya, and that's pretty well established. Then you have a montage of the rest of the siblings leaving with Kaya's narration. Again, Kaya's narration is very heavy in this entire thing. it is what it is. I'm not one of those who says God help you if you use narration or voiceover, but I there's more elegant, less clunky ways to deal with it, and there's also much more clunky ways to deal with it. So anyway, siblings leave. Scene 9. Oh, you know what? I'm pointing at the wrong thing, aren't I? Here, we're down here now. So siblings leave, which is 9. 10 is lost in the marsh. So Kaya takes the boat out to sort of escape Pa. That's the whole thing, because her older brother, who comes back, his name escapes me. He tells her, when Pa gets scary, just hide in the marsh. It's the whole hide where the crawdads sing kind of thing. That's basically the only reference to crawdads. Didn't see any crawdads in the movie, so she's hiding. She gets lost. She runs into Tate. Tate takes her home with his boat, and then the next thing is it's just her and Pa, and it's a lot of voiceover, and the implication is time is very much passing, and Pa takes her to Jumpin's store where he can get gas and get some groceries, and Jumpin and his wife Mia, is that her name? Mabel. Jumpin and Mabel are the only black family in this story. I'm not going to really editorialize that at all, other than to say, in my limited experience in dealing with small communities in the South, I wouldn't say the word segregation, but I would say that there are white communities and that there are black communities, and there is some overlap, but that really only happens in the city environment. In the smallest environments, it does seem segregated. Speaking as a person who grew up in the Midwest, I honestly don't know. So sure, for the sake of this, Jumpin and Mabel are the only 2 black people in town, and they live on the outskirts in this little store, and they're treated as such because it's the 1950s. Sure, again, knowing what I know about the author, yikes. But you treat the material you're given, I guess. Anyway, so let's see. Takes to Jumpin, so he meets Jumpin and Mabel says, you should be in school. You're a grown up. Here's a sucker. Blah blah blah. So Kaya decides to go to school. She gets ridiculed for being the marsh girl and runs home. Of course she does. Like, how could she not? It's absolutely horrifying. I get it. And then the last thing, the big thing that sort of sends us into act. See if I can get this back to regular size. So the last thing that gets us out of Act 1 and into Act 2, so into the go period, if you're doing the story well, is Pa gets a letter from Ma, but we've established Kaya can't read, and so Pa reads it and then burns it to ensure that Kaya's never going to read it. Yeah, I mean, from an editorializing standpoint, she already can't read, and she has no friends to read this letter to her, so why burn the letter to begin with? But that sort of jumps into Act 2, where he burns everything of Ma's, and so that puts us in Act 2 because he leaves. And so, again, just based on how things are being presented, it seems like Pa leaves, like, right after he gets that letter from Ma. Okay. Like, sure, I'm just a little confused about the chronology of everything, because it seems like Ma left on a Tuesday, the kids left on a Wednesday, and Pa left on a Thursday. I think it's supposed to be multiple years take place, but it very much seems like Ma left very quickly, and then also she sent a letter that Pa got angry and burned all of her things very quickly. Anyway, going into Act 2A. Here we go. We got Kaya alone. She's selling oysters to Jumpin. There's this really actually like quite well done scene. Honestly, probably one of the stronger scenes in the entire movie, where she basically can't tell Jumpin that she's alone now, but she needs to be able to make money in order to sustain herself, because she's committed herself to living in the marsh because it's her home, which is an ongoing theme. This is her home. Sure. I mean, the logic of it is not bulletproof, considering everybody in her family left that place. And also, she's utterly alone, and so crippling loneliness next to a town. Yeah, okay. I think more time could have been spent sort of establishing the why of her wanting to live in the marsh. because there's just she seems like a very intelligent, very like socially motivated person, and to live basically an entire life alone is torturous. And I feel like I don't know, the way things played out. I feel like something must have been skipped over or left out because it just, yeah, you know, if you live alone in your depression, you either end up in an avenue where you interact with people, or you end up going the other direction. It's not really a sustainable thing. So it's a very toxic way to live. Editorializing again. Anyway, so we got so Kaya's alone. Really great moment with Jumpin, where he's like, okay, if you want to sell oysters to me, these are the rules. And then we're back in the present. Kaya gets close from Mabel and Jumpin in jail, because again, they're still a beloved family in Kaya's life. And then we're going into Tom's opening remarks. And I will say, just because it really doesn't, it just sort of, the court case stuff just happens occasionally, which I think is very appropriate considering it's kind of mundane, and it really doesn't offer much. It's very straightforward. I assume the book, again, because it's, it's so hard based on the book, but if you just look at the blue, basically court case, maybe court case, court case, court case, court case, court case, and then court case. So there's just not a lot of court case there, which, yeah, so it is what it is, but it's very straightforward. It's the sort of like diet version of court, which is to say you're only getting absolutely what's necessary, and honestly it was almost too much, but for structuring the story, I think it's a fine thing, because it's sort of, you get into this rhythm where essential evidence is presented in court, and then it's, how did we get here? Kaya's flashback on remembering how we got here, which is the thing I also want to adjust at the end, because we're dealing with, I wouldn't say like an unreliable narrator, but definitely a person who's not telling you the whole story, which is kind of the whole point of the movie. So the fact that we never really get Kaya's objective opinion about certain things, there's an explanation why, but it seems so like, it seems unfinished. Anyway, where were we? So let's see here. Opening remarks, yeah, boring. It's fine. It was what it is. It's court, court doing court things. Next up, Kaya meets Tate, teenage Tate. They have this feather thing where she leaves a feather in a note, and he leaves her a feather in a note, and then catches her when she's trying to escape, and they have this weird interaction, and she admits she can't read, so she doesn't know what the note said, and he goes, "Hey, I want to teach you how to read," and this is her first friendship. It's actually it's pretty sweet. That leads into her inviting him over after he teaches her how to read, and she's, here's, this is my life. I draw animals and flowers and stuff, and I'm lonely, and because I think she's going through her Bible, and it's sort of got the genealogy of all of her family, and she admits that she misses all of them, which is sort of it's one of those few moments in the story, or at least in the movie, where she admits that she's like cripplingly lonely. As you are, like, this whole movie is about loneliness, but I feel like there was so much information they were trying to pack into this movie that they gloss over the fact that she is like, I can't even really reasonably imagine the headspace she's in at this point at her life, because it's devastating. It's not sustainable once again. Anyway, let's see. So she admits to loneliness. Scene 18. Tate. This is their first sort of romantic moment where he admits that he's got damage too. His sister and his mom died in a car accident going to get him a birthday present in town, and so that's why he doesn't go to town. That's why it's just him and his dad. This whole thing, he opens up. It's the twilight of it all, if you will. It's when all of a sudden the sort of the melodrama that is Twilight, it jumps into the story, and I honestly think that's where this story kind of falls apart. It is what it is, though. It's the first love, emotional investment, that kind of thing. They become boyfriend and girlfriend. Okay, and then let's go into search. Do I go high enough up? Yeah, here we go. Okay. Um, the romantic sequence, scene 19, Tate and Kaya. I think she narrates it. It's basically just a lot of kissing. It's straight up Twilight. It's just, it's the teen romance of it all. It is what it is. That's a lot of what this story purported itself to be, and I assume the book is the same way. Not my cup of tea, but again, grown ass man, so who knows? Um, it is what it is. That's the genre we're working in. Scene 20, Kaya's birthday. She doesn't know it's her birthday. He gives her a cake, and they get down to almost doing it, and then at the last moment. But again, the way this scene plays out, I kind of feel some kind of way about, because Tate is sort of very much on the gas about getting her clothes off for the doing it aspect of it. But then when it comes to actually the doing it, he's the one that's like, wait, I don't want to do this. You're too fragile. You're not like me. I'm not fragile. You're fragile. And so we shouldn't do this because it's too important to me that it's too important to you. And I was like, which I think is, I assume it's a hallmark of the genre of the you can never really do it of these teen romances. Am I reading into that correctly? I honestly don't know. But he like it's just the way the scene plays out. It's very hot and cold, and it's at first it seemed like he was pushing her too far, too fast. But then he like pulled back, and she was like, no, we're good. And he's like, no, we're not good because you're fragile. I don't know. Is that how the book played out? It's oof. It's oof. The way just the scene made me uncomfortable. It is what it is. Maybe I'm an old man. Scene 21. This is a montage of the seasons passing, and I think the idea was meant to be that, they're growing in love, they're growing together, but they still haven't done it because he chickened out that one time when he was all about it. And so seasons pass, and Tate finds out he's going to go to college because that was his whole thing. Yeah, and she's again, there's narration. She seems okay with the whole thing. She seems like things are going as expected, even though they had that weird moment. Anyway, scene 22, Tate is going to college for real. He tells her that. He tells her, hey, come with me. She goes, I don't think so. I'm the Marsh girl. I live in the Marsh. This is my home. You can go. And he goes, okay, well, I'm going to have to go, even if you're not coming with me. And she goes, well, you're never going to come back, which, yeah, I mean, yes, very much so. That's what Jeopardy is. That's what people having diverging lives is, for sure. So I feel like it wasn't totally sold very correctly that obviously he was going. Like, as soon as he found out he was going to college, this conversation was going to happen. But the way it was presented, it seemed like this was the first time she's heard of it. It is what it is. He does this thing in the next scene 23, where he's leaving for real, because in scene 22 they have this sort of like half argument about what do you mean you're leaving, and then he comes back and goes, one more night, and they sleep together under the blankets on the porch because it's hot, I assume. And so that was great. I don't know why that changed the stakes at all, but scene 23, Tate's leaving for real this time, and he's given her a list of publishers because she needs to publish her stuff, because he explains it as you need to be able to make money, and so by selling your work you should be able to make a little bit of money while I go to college and do college things. Okay, okay. And he goes, but I'll be back in the 4th of July, even though I'm leaving for college in the summertime. Also, that's a month away. So it seems like, at least timeline wise, it's been like 9 months of them together, and it's going to be 1 month of them apart after ostensibly what was a fight about the fact that he was going, but he's going to be back in a month. Yeah. And then the end of Act 2A, the midpoint, scene 24, is 4th of July. He told her to wait for him on the beach. He was going to show up. The dude doesn't show up. And so she sits there, she waits, she gets increasingly sad. It's actually played quite well. I have a lot of respect for how it was played. Dude doesn't show up. She's devastated. That's the whole thing. That's what we're dealing with. Rightly so. I mean, he straight up blew her off, and it had only been a month. So are they even broken up? I get it. I understand her frustration, and she puts that into the sort of the same category, which is an ongoing theme of this, which is people always leave. People never stand up to their word. That whole thing, which he blew her off and he told her he was going to show up. I get it. The very well, translated. Let's see. Should have worn glasses. So 25 is she gets over Tate. And again, it's narration. I think it takes place over a period of time. The bird, there's like a falcon that knocks on her window. Again, then she goes and hangs out with geese. That's her getting over it. I assume that took months, but the way it plays out, it could have taken a day. 26. We're back in the courtroom because it's blue, and it's the missing footprints and fingerprints, because the whole thing about Chase, who we haven't even seen in this story yet, is he fell from the fire tower, which is like a 12-story or a 6-story tower. He fell through a grate and fell to his death and hit his head, blah, blah, blah. But there were no footprints. And we've established that Kaya is so paranoid and so afraid of people that even when she's hanging out with Tate, not Chase, but Tate, again, or I haven't said this yet, but her love interests are Tate and Chase. Boy, those sound alike. I think there's usefulness in having two completely distinct names. Kaya is a distinct name. Kaya and Tate, those are distinct sounds. Kaya and Chase, distinct sounds. Chase, Tate, very close together. So she lost my place. The missing footprints. So we've established that when she's with Tate, she'll like fix the foliage behind her to make it look like she wasn't there. So that's sort of, it's not really acknowledged, but it's the reasonable expectation that maybe she is capable of this. And the prosecutor is definitely pushing the idea that she would have known to cover up the footprints, and that therefore she killed Chase because she's the kind of person that would. And the town has already decided that she did because she's the Marsh Girl. That's the whole thing. Everybody calls her Marsh Girl in the story, like everybody. Anyway, 27, Kaya meets Chase. So we finally meet Chase after having heard about him several times in court. And it's a whole thing. I think he runs into her at Jumpin's place, and she finds out there's like a D story that is property people have been taking pictures of her property because they want to develop it. And so she asks Jumpin, well, who owns the house? And he's like, I don't know, you should ask somebody. And she goes, okay. And at some point she goes and talks to the local like commissioner guy in the town, and he goes, oh yeah, you own it because your great grandpa owned it, but you owe like an impossible amount of back taxes, so whoever pays the back taxes first is gonna control that, and so you're pretty much boned unless you can come up with an amount of money you will never see in your lifetime. But best of luck to you, Marsh Girl. He's nicer than that, but that's kind of the vibe. But anyway, but in the scene where she meets Chase, sort of on the dock at Jumpin's place, I think she sees him before that. I think she's on the beach writing, because I don't think it's ever established that she goes to the beach where everybody goes to just hang out, and she has her little notebook, and she draws in her notebook while everybody else is having fun. I think that's the moment she and Chase make eye contact, but then basically the same scene later, because it's two adjacent scenes. She meets him on the dock, and he says, hey, how's it going? You're Kaya, you're the swamp girl or the marsh girl. Anyway, scene 30. Let's just keep going. It's easy to get muddled in these, I'm realizing. Anyway, so I messed it up. There we go. There's scene 30. Scene 30. The red fibers. So we're back in court, and it's the red fibers, and we know it as the ski cap. And I don't know if we've been able to see the ski cap, but I think we've definitely seen the ski cap by this point. It gets sort of teased later, or sort of tossed around later, as to who owns the ski cap, because it seems like the court case, if they were building to something, it would be that the ski cap is going to point to who killed Chase, because it's the red fibers of the ski cap. That's the whole thing. They're saying it was her because they found it in her place, because the cops did find it in her place. So it makes sense that it was her, but you find out later that it might not be her, because it was Tate's cap. So there was that. Anyway, 31, Kaya's letter back from the publishers. So Kaya did submit stuff, and she gets a letter back, and she gets a big fat check, and so she's super excited. Actually, no, she doesn't get paid. I think she just gets the letter. She gets the letter saying, "Thank you for your submission. We're really excited. Please send us all your stuff." That's what it is. But before she can do anything, Chase, who she's been spending time with now, where is the Chase thing? She meets Chase. Oh, you know what? I need to back up. I jumped ahead of myself. Shame. Okay, so jump back to 26. The missing footprints. Kaya meets Chase, and then the next thing is Kaya and Chase kiss, and she sort of narratively talks about how she's ambivalent about Chase, but she's, at least she's over Tate, and so that's important that she's over Tate, and she's not alone. That was the whole thing. She spent the last 10 years alone, basically, since Tate abandoned her for college, or 5 years? I think it was 5 years. Anyway, so it's a whole thing, and this is when, Chase is all about kissing her and all this stuff, and he shows her the watchtower, the fire tower. She did not know it existed. She'd never been up it. She looks down and she realizes she said something semi-poetic like, "Hey, this is like knowing a friend but never seeing their whole face, and now you see their whole face." Sure. For the sake of what they're doing, sure. Scene 29. Kaya shows Chase her home, and unlike Tate, it's played against. Man, if they had recut this, it would have been interesting, because when she shows Tate her home, he's fascinated and she wanted to show him the home, but now that it's Chase, she wasn't really ready to show him the home, and it's messy, and so he comes in and he's excited. He's going, "This is great," and she's like, "I wasn't ready for visitors," which is the opposite of how she treated Tate. That would have been a good sort of pairing those things together, but I see why they didn't do it, because they're trying to go chronologically-ish. But he's sort of just like, Chase is just kind of like way too into what's happening, which is kind of intense. Anyway, so now we can go to the red fibers on the thing, which I kind of talked about already. So yeah, so now we're back in court. 30, the red fibers. I talked about the hat, that it is Tate's hat, but ultimately they find it in Kaya's house, because of course they did, because why wouldn't they? Kaya gets a letter back from the publishers, 31, I believe. And before she can even say anything, because she's excited and she wants to share this with Chase, Chase comes in and goes, "Hey, guess who got promoted? I got a 6-pack. We're gonna party." And it's one of those moments where obviously Chase doesn't care about her. He's down to clown. 32, he convinces her to go on an Asheville trip because he needs to pick up stuff for his new job in Asheville, and they make like a 2-day of it. They're in a hotel room. They have a doing it scene. It's not great. I wouldn't call it abusive, but it's definitely one of those like not great doing it scenes where, and I think the implication is that was her losing her V card, I think. And she seems just genuinely, I wouldn't say traumatized, but just not happy with circumstances, but it is what it is. Oh man, dropped out for a second. Anyway, we have the shell. So earlier, I think when they're celebrating Chase's promotion and her not talking about the fact that she just had a publisher pick up her thing, she finds a beautiful shell and it's important to her. She talks about it. He goes, "You're so smart. You should have it." She has it. And then when they're at Asheville in the hotel, she turns it into a necklace. She gives it to him via necklace. It's a whole thing. He wears it, which is going to be important in a second, because in court, 33, the missing shell necklace. That's a whole thing. His mom talks about how she hated the necklace, but he always wore it. And whoever killed him took the necklace because it was the only thing not there. Even though they're in the marsh, and if he had fallen from a great height, it's reasonable to expect the marsh ate the necklace, as they proved earlier that the marsh can eat footprints, because that's what water does in the marsh. So it is what it is. 34, Tate shows up. So Tate just sort of shows up out of the blue, and it makes Kaya really mad. And he basically says, "Hey, I'm back. Sorry I blew you off 5 years ago, and I feel bad about it, and I'm back now, so I want to have a relationship, and sorry. And she goes, get away from me. And honestly, truest moment in the entire thing. I really gotta say, like, yeah, I'm 100% on board for Kaya having a very negative reaction to Tate just sort of showing up, as he is sort of the defining guy up until this point that, other than Pa, has totally torpedoed her life. So yeah, kick rocks, bud. Yeah. Let's see. Confronts Chase. Oh, the other thing is, okay, so before, oh man, so that was 35. So that was what I just described as 35. So 30, man, it doesn't help that everything is chronological, and so they're all sort of like connected to each other. Because if I did every single scene, there would be like 80 scenes, but I'm going basically just by beats. So I messed it up again. Chronology, man. So before Tate does the "I love you, I want to be with you" thing, he runs into, at Jumpin's dock, Chase, who's bragging about doing it with Marsh Girl to his buddies, and they're joking, and Tate goes, "Hey, don't talk to her like that." And Chase gets in his face and takes off his red ski cap, which is that red ski cap, and so Jumpin hands it back to Tate and goes, "Hey, chill out, man. It's not worth it. He's a frat guy. It is what it is." And so I think that must be why Tate decided to go confront Maya about this, or Kaya and Maya. Anyway, so yeah, that's the whole thing. So the order of events is the missing necklace. Tate comes back and runs into Chase, who is a douche, because that's sort of the defining characteristic about Chase, other than the fact that he's handsome, he's kind of a douche. And then Tate goes and confronts Kaya and says, "Hey, he sucks. I need to tell you something about him. Never mind, it's not worth it. I'll see you around. By the way, I'm back, and I'm out of college, and I'm working down the street," is basically what he was saying. Yeah, okay. 36, Kaya, can we see it? Yeah, 36. Kaya runs into Chase in town. So she's coming out of the Piggly Wiggly, I believe. And again, it's semi-established that Kaya doesn't really go into town because she's only in town a few times. But again, we've only seen her sort of in the coming out of the town part of it. It's not I want to go to town, I'm too afraid to go to town. It's just, I'm in town, okay, I'm leaving town. So she comes out of the door, runs into Chase, who's with his friends and some girls, and Chase is like, "Hey, we don't know each other, remember?" And she goes, "Oh, okay." And he goes, "By the way, here's my fiance, so-and-so, Claire, the homecoming queen, my fiance." And she goes, "Great, nice to meet you, I'll see you around." And she leaves. Devastating, because now she's realized her entire relationship with Chase has been a lie, because he's a cheater, he's a jerk, he's a douche, he's been engaged this whole time, and he's cheating on both of them, and he sucks. Which, all evidence in favor of Chase being a douche. This is just it seemed like an inevitability at this point, because he's been a douche the whole time. So yeah, that's the low point. That's the end of Act 2. That's Kaya straight up like devastated. Yeah, so we just finished right there. We're going into Act 3. And so Kaya is devastated. We go to 37. Just gotta get through it. Gotta get through it so we can talk about it. God. Okay. Had a little bit too much special drink last night, and I'm feeling it. And also, I want to get this story out of my head. I wouldn't say sick of it, but I'm getting fatigued with it. Okay, so boom, there we go. So Act 3, Chase basically tries to chase Kaya back to her place, because she obviously was devastated that she found out that he was engaged and is kind of just a wang, just straight up a wang. And she knows, as we've established, one of the things that they've established pretty well, every time somebody comes looking for her, she hides. And so he comes looking for her, she hides, bing, bang, boom. That is what it is. Scene 38. Kaya is alone again, but this time she's sort of okay with it. And again, it's the really heavy narration, voiceover stuff, where she's talking about she's alone. And she finds out that publishers sent her a box with some books of hers and a big fat check. And again, it's if the tax check on the property was more than she was ever going to make in 10 lifetimes. This was a millionaire's amount of money for her. And so she gets this giant check, and she's, you know, she buys her house, she buys her property, she buys stuff. She has people flying furniture into the marsh. It's kind of awesome. It's a really good moment for her. So she goes from Chase is a monster, my entire relationship with him has been a lie, to girl just got paid. You know, not a bad place to be, but obviously there is the looming sort of the chase of it all. But girlfriend got paid. So scene 39, her brother shows up, and I believe he's in the Air Force. I think that's what it was, or the reserves. But he shows up and says, "Hey, I saw your book, and I knew I had to come back and find you because I'm so proud of you." Blah, blah, blah. She goes, "Yeah, it's been lonely." He's like, "I'm sorry I left, and I haven't heard from any of my other siblings. P.S. Ma died." And she goes, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, she tried to find you. She wrote Pa a letter saying she wanted to get custody, but then, you know, life got in the way and she ended up dying of leukemia, I believe is what it was." And she goes, "That makes sense." And so that was the moment, because again, of all the sort of threads, one of them is Ma's coming back. As the movie is presented, I'm not convinced that that was really a thread, but yes, every so often she did mention she thinks about Ma. I guess the implication was Ma's coming back. It seemed very clear to me that Ma was not coming back, but again, suspension of disbelief. Anyway, 40. Kaya is at Jumpin's getting groceries, and Chase is goofy, presumably very drunk with his buddies, and runs into her at Jumpin's place and wants to talk to her, and she says, "Leave me alone," because of course. And so he chases her to into the marsh and attacks her and tries to R-word her, and just about does, and she clocks him in the head with a stone and gets him off of her, and she gets in a couple good slots, a couple good slaps, a couple good punches, a couple good kicks, but has a pretty good gash on the side of her head, even after she got him pretty hard with the rock a couple times. Yeah, so Chase has now been revealed to be just molten evil. Wasn't really a mystery to anybody but Kaya, because, and again, you know, you don't know until you know, but he tried to R her, and she was able to fend him off. Yeah, you know, it could go either way, but I'm glad she was able to fend him off for the sake of how the story goes. And that actually gets shown up in court, because one of the fishermen's just happens to be going by on his boat and hears her go, if you do this again, I will K you. And so, you know, don't ever come near me again, because I'm going to K you. That shows up in court, obviously. Yeah. And so again, scene 41, she's now hiding again in the marsh in her boat as Tate looks, or as Chase looks for her, because again, he wants revenge. He's got a gash on the side of his head, but he's looking to spill some more blood, and he never finds her. And when she gets back to her house, 42, her house is trashed. If there was any evidence that Chase is just a straight up monster, I feel like we were given as much as we needed, and then given more. But you know, it's not new information, but it is an escalation for sure. So Chase is a monster. He trashed her place, because of course he did. Because why wouldn't he? Because he's Chase. Sucks, you know. Bad people gonna do bad. That's one of those things in this story which really does cut against the fact that I googled this author. But bad people gonna do bad. It is what it is. Let's just get through this. Excuse me. So we're in the final part of Act 3. So we're at 43. Tate shows up. Kaya tells him to leave. He shows up at night, and I forget what he tries to say, but she thinks it's going to be Chase. It's just she has a rock and realizes it's Tate and goes, "You need to leave." And I think it's supposed to be implied that she's got a plan. She has a plan. I didn't get that when I watched it, though. In context, I feel like that's probably what it was, but I didn't get that when I watched it. And he goes, "You're cold. Here, have my hat," and gives her the red ski cap. And so that's how she gets the red ski cap. So up until this point, I was convinced that obviously Tate Cade Chase because he had all the reason to. He's seeing what Chase did to Kaya. Like, you only need one reason, and Kaya's offered like 10 to Tate, especially, to just F Chase up. But he gives her the hat. So that's how we know, that's how she got the hat. So we know whatever happened, it was probably whoever had the hat. Anyway, so he leaves. And then the rest of it is pretty much court. So 44 court. The big thing is Tate jump in, and her name is Mabel. Tate, jumping in Mabel, Tate, and then her brother all show up in court. That's a big escalation because up until then nobody's shown up. I don't know why, but okay, that's fine. 45, and this is the last sort of like flashback we have, if you can call it that. Kaya gets a bus schedule for jumping. And so basically the idea is she's going to go meet with her publisher in Allentown or whatever, and she's going to take the bus, and that's a whole thing, and Jumpin basically pleads with her and says, hey, it seems like Chase is going to K you, so you need to keep checking in with me because I don't want to have time go by and not see you and have to worry about you being dead, because that seems to be where it's going. That seems to be how it was with your pa. Please be responsible. And she goes, I got it. Let me just write down the bus schedule. Okay. And the rest of this is just the court case. And so this is all sort of present day stuff. Present day being 1969, I believe, or 1967. Anyway. So we have an intercut of the court case and sort of flashbacks to, from the point of view of the women that are being interviewed in the court case, about did she take the bus trip. And the idea is that the women are convinced that she left town, and the prosecution is arguing that she could have left town, checked into the hotel, come all the way back, murdered Chase, hopped in like the 2 a.m. bus, got back to town, meet with her publishers, and nobody's the wiser. This grand conspiracy, bing bang boom. She's actually a genius when it comes to getting away with murders. The whole thing. That was what the prosecution was arguing, but we don't see that. We just see from the point of view of the women going, "Oh man, she's wearing makeup. Like, she's getting on a bus. Where could she possibly be going in makeup? She's the Marsh girl." 47. Kai doesn't want to testify, and so I think she's in the jail cell, and Tom says, "Hey, I don't usually put people on the stand, but you're such a quiet, sort of sympathetic person. It might be nice just to tell your story." And she basically says, they've already judged me. I don't hate them, but they blah, blah, blah. They hate me. So I'm not going to give them the dignity of responding to them, deuces. Cool. Fair enough. I'm not really, again, I feel like I'm missing a real essential piece to why that was necessary, but sure. Okay. 48, voiceover of the prosecutor, talking about how she could have done this whole, like, taking 4 buses over 24 hours thing to go kill Chase. While this voiceover is happening, Tom is outside sort of seeing people, seeing the town, because that's his whole thing, is he's the town. And he's sort of putting it together that as he's looking over at Tate working with his dad, that Tate probably did this. It was Tate's hat. Tate had every reason to do it, blah, blah, blah. Like, she told him to go away, so it was probably Tate. And again, his responsibility is not to Tate. His responsibility is to Kaya, to get her off. So it seems like she's going to be found innocent because it seems pretty obvious that Tate did it. Yeah. Anyway. 49, back to court. Tom does his closing remarks, basically saying, who knows what happened that night, but it obviously wasn't Kaya, the Marsh girl, because she just couldn't have done it. She wasn't in town, and everything we know about her, she wouldn't have done it. It is what it is. And then there's like a really quick. So this movie does this thing where I would have cut away and gone to something else, it cuts away, but then it cuts to the next thing. And so it goes from, I wonder what the jury verdict is going to be. We have the jury verdict. And no time passes. And so it's like doing the opposite of what I think a cut could do, which is, I wonder what the jury verdict is going to be. Now it's time to ruminate. Now that we've had enough time to ruminate, now we have the jury verdict. But it did the opposite. It goes, I wonder what the jury verdict is going to be. Here's the jury verdict. Not guilty. She got off. She's free. She kind of celebrates, and she tells her brother, take me home, please. And she goes home. And it's a whole thing. She finds Tate. She reconnects with Tate. They fall back in love because he was the only boy she's ever loved. That was the whole thing. For the sake of what they're doing, again, this is one of those things that, based on what we know about the story, he, more so than anybody other than Chase, has been the devastating factor in her adult life. He left her at a critical moment when she was a teenager to go to college, and blew her off for 5 years, and basically, you could even argue, got her into a relationship with Chase, which is the monster of the story. And so the sort of the only man I've ever loved thing is kind of, I don't know if I totally agree with that, but that's fine. And then we have basically Kaya and Tate together. He proposes to her. She says, well, we're already kind of married, so let's not do that. And then we have a montage of them being old, them doing their regular things. They basically just live in the marsh for the rest of their lives, and this whole thing. And then we have this sort of magical realism moment where she talks about she's old now, and when it's her time to go, she hopes she goes quietly, and she sees her mama, and it's this whole thing, magical realism, sees mama on the dock, that whole thing. And then she dies. And so we see old Tate come over and see her dead in the boat and goes, oh my God. And then he goes through her journal, and, it's basically a chronology of everything she's done, because she's this really well respected, like, author and anthropologist who just lives in the swamp, basically. And then he finds at the very last page the big spoiler that is the movie, the spoiler, the one thing that has been sort of referenced over and over again that has not been solved. He finds in the end of the journal, she has the shell necklace. She definitely killed Chase. And she just happened to be this mastermind on killing the most evil man she's ever known, if you don't count Pa. Yeah, so that's the story as it stands. I'm exhausted. A couple things before I start re-breaking it a little bit. The story stuck with me. It was, for its faults, and I think most of those faults are in the sort of the. Go back to the. Oh no, I forgot to do this. For its faults, I think the romantic storyline is really where it's just. It goes from this sort of like fairly taut, sort of Gone Girl-esque thriller a little bit, and then it just sort of switches tones to just a sort of a Twilight-esque romance thing, and I can't speak to the writing of the book, but there's cheesy, and then there's Twilight, it goes from like too subtle to understand, the sweet spot, very cheesy, and then Twilight, and it's sort of entering Twilight territory in how ridiculous it is. But I don't think that's actually what's wrong with it. But yeah, the story stuck with me. It haunts. I'd say probably every 6 months I see a movie that just sort of hangs with me. This one did that. Don't Worry, Darling, which I've done in one of these on, did not do that. So credit where credit's due for this movie. Yeah, let's get into it. So let's just look at this whole thing, because I think I already know the answer to all of this, which is it's the romantic stuff. So, zone of comfort. Kaya gets arrested, and here's how we got to now. It starts. For what we're doing, it would be nice to know anything about Kaya, and we don't. I think that was on purpose. There's a real point of view narration thing going on in this movie that I think is probably an affectation of the book too, which is it's from Kaya's point of view, but she's an unreliable narrator, and you find it ultimately at the end with the shell thing. But so she's unreliable, but she's not presented as unreliable.
there's no indication that she wouldn't be unreliable. The other thing is there's other points of view that can't inherently be Kaya happening. One is Tom, and he sort of represents the town, and he's only really there for the present time. So at the very beginning, the very end, Tom is the town. But there's also like Tate has a couple of sides with his dad that Kaya could have not inherently known, and then Chase also. So there's a few things. So it. I don't know. It's sort of like God's perspective happens when it's convenient to, and then it's Kaya's perspective all the other times. And I think that muddles what it's trying to accomplish, but that's fine. That's not actually my problem. I wish we knew more about Kaya at the beginning because we just know she's the Marsh girl and she's basically a stereotype of a person. Need. The need actually kind of works. If you're saying the need is not to be abandoned, because her entire childhood is about abuse and abandonment, specifically abandonment. So if her need is not to be abandoned, I think that actually works. Going into entering the unfamiliar, she's alone. She's trying to pick up her life. That's where I feel like they're not congruous. Is because if it's about abandonment, she solves her abandonment immediately. She takes action. She's her own person. The whole thing, and it really culminates with the fact that she meets Tate and falls in love with Tate. Adapt to this new thing, which is Tate. The whole Tate of it all. So it basically is, here's the present, and then how do we get to here? Who she is that has formed her personality. Here's the second part of her personality, which is a reaction to the first part. First love, second love, which is Chase, which is a different kind of love because Chase is kind of weird from the beginning. So she basically. The unfamiliar was learning how to be alone and being a person. The adapting to the unfamiliar is being able to love Tate. The find it is getting over Tate and finding Chase. Pay the price, which is the fact that Chase is a monster and sucks. And then the return, which is now I have to go back and figure out what's so wrong, which is all the terrible things Chase will do now. So he was bad here. He's extra bad here. And then change, now that I have changed, and actually I'm pretty okay with that, other than the fact that it's very straightforward and it's pretty telegraphed. So as far as the storylines go, I don't have a huge problem. I think they could have done a better job clarifying things and her priorities. Maybe that's what I'll talk about. Her priorities are just back and forth all over the place. So that'll be something. So go ahead and take these off because we don't need these. So we'll call it Kaya's priorities. Call this important. That's the first thing. Is Kaya's priorities seem to be all over the place. Which again, if the argument is she's a girl finding herself, yeah, when you're a kid, when you're growing up, your priorities change as you gain more time, wisdom, experience, of course. But her priorities are unclear because if her priority was Ma coming home, we have it at the very beginning, we have it at the very end. It's not in the middle. It just isn't. And so that drives me crazy. And the other thing is, basically the middle of the story is her two major relationships. Her first one with Tate that lasts like 9 months, and then her second one with Chase that lasts an undisclosed amount of time and ends in absolute disaster. So I guess her relationships. And I think her relationships of it all is going to be ultimately what matters, because there seems to be like a distinct difference in writing, like writing style, from like the tone is different in the blue stuff, the present day, like judge, jury, court stuff is one tone. The her being a child stuff is pretty much the same tone all the way throughout, throughout her being a child into her 20s. So that's fine, but the tone of this one and basically all the genuinely romantic stuff took a different tone. And I don't actually have a problem with it when it comes to Chase, because Chase is such an insidious character that it kind of makes sense for the tone to be different, because in sort of accepted. So the tone of all the Kaya and Tate stuff actually is sort of consistent with Kaya's sort of internal monologue, which is fine. And then Chase shows up and the tone completely changes. But because we're not close enough to Kaya at this point, we don't know what that means, other than the fact that Chase is obviously a douche. But yeah, so let's see. Chase her home. Chase's promotion is a thing. The Asheville trip is obviously a big one. That's the big one. Chase Kaya's house. So, the middle part. Some people call it fun and games. I think that's where we have an obstacle, which is that the outside of the sandwich, the bread, is more or less fine, which is hilarious because that's the chronology of how everything goes. Is everything in blue just plays out chronologically in its own thing. The rest of Act One that's green, it's not. It basically is just more backstory, but for what they're doing, the idea is when you go into Act Two, you're entering a new threshold. So I can sort of understand that you needed all of this, like she has a bad childhood in order to get to Act Two. I guess. But then we get into the sappy stuff, which again is a hallmark of the genre, because this is supposed to be like a teen romance thing, coming of age, which is I consider a dirty word, but people still use it. Yeah, and so it's like it's very straightforward, and Kaya sort of is at odds with whatever obstacle she is until she ends up in these two relationships where she goes from being an individual and in her own world to very much about the relationship. It's sort of the experience of getting lost in the relationship, and for that I actually give the writers a lot of credit, because that's very much a thing. The problem is I don't think we know enough about Kaya to understand how she actually feels. It's sort of strongly implied that Kaya was devastatingly in love with Tate, but even how they sort of almost do it, the way the scene plays out, it's problematic. I would say it's very not great. It's not great. It's kind of the logic of like the hot person talks to you at the bar, you're open to it. The ugly person talks to you at the bar, get away from me, creep. It's kind of that logic where if it wasn't Tate, this scene here where he jumps on her and takes her shirt off would have been absolutely horrifying, which is kind of mirrored later with Romeo over here, right there, scene 40, where he literally tries to R her. So yes, I like the fact that they're mirrored, but because so much time has passed, because we really don't understand Kaya's sort of internal headspace of how she's interacting with Tate, other than the fact that we get to the 4th of July and she's straight up devastated, which sort of recontextualizes everything up until that point of their relationship, because we just don't know enough about who they are and how they interact with each other than the fact that he, at a moment where they were going to get hot and heavy, went, let's do this, and then once they started to do it, he went, wait, you're fragile, I'm not fragile, we shouldn't do this because you're fragile and I will hurt you. And then that never gets addressed, other than the fact that he leaves. Obviously, Chase does the opposite because Chase is a monster, but he's basically just, on the gas the whole time, which is, correct to his character. But again, we don't really. There's a moment in scene 28 where Kaya literally in voiceover goes, "I don't know how I feel about Chase," which I think is the most honest moment in the entire story, because that's the only moment where I sort of was signaled, oh my god, like she really is just in sort of a post Tate depression. How do you get over the depression of someone leaving your life? Yeah, so she's kind of numb. She's sort of emotionally numb, but then that has consequences, which ultimately leads to almost getting art. Yeah, I think the issue that I'm having, because I don't have a problem with any of the stuff that takes place in court. I don't have a problem with. It's kind of mundane, and it's really there more as a plot device than anything else. But it is interesting because the stakes are she could go to jail, she could get executed. It's for real, and it's very much set up that she is innocent and that she is being like it's a miscarriage of justice that's happening. It's very much set up that way. So I'm okay with that. And the fact that it's got a wild twist that kind of gets telegraphed, let's be honest. I'm good with that too. I like that a lot. The child stuff, it is what it is. The falling in love with Tate, I think we either needed more time with Tate, because as soon as things settle down, that's when the montage of the seasons passing happens. So that means that everything is important up until the montage, and then we're sort of just in cruise. But we don't really understand how she feels about him until he blows her off on the 4th of July. We have sort of a hint of it when he tells her he's going to college, but that's anybody would have that reaction to it. They're what, like, I think the way it should have been played is, and it starts this way, is everybody leaves me, you're another one to leave me, but then we don't see actually how she is when people leave, because she just sort of abandons that as an idea. And so if in the moment where he goes, I'm going to college, and she goes, everybody leaves, you're like nobody else, if she actually did some sort of extreme behavior that would have justified him going, oh my god, I had no idea that it was going to be like this. I think that's what we're missing. We're missing a critical choice from her, because stuff just happens. I mean, to her credit, she does take charge, which is very good to have a character sort of take charge at the end, but we only know that in post. We only know that as a post-mortem once we find the final piece of the puzzle, which is the necklace. We don't know that she's taking charge, and there's nothing to indicate in her narration, in the story itself, that she's actually doing this. All we know is we've established that she's absolutely terrified of abandonment and not very good about abuse, and wants to live in the marsh, gets abandoned after falling in love, enters an abusive relationship with a manipulative man. That sort of comes to a head when he tries to art her, and then off screen, unsatisfyingly, let's be honest, it's found out that she actually takes matters into her own hands. Passivity, I guess. So I think it's a couple things. Let me zoom in here. I think it's okay. Here we go. So I think it's a few things. I think we don't know enough about Kaya to worry about her priorities. We don't know enough about Kaya's priorities because we only really understand that she doesn't like to get abandoned, as everybody doesn't, but she has, real world experience about it. She doesn't like abuse. They don't really deal much with the alcohol stuff, because her pa was an alcoholic. That was absolutely established quite efficiently. And it's strongly implied that Chase was drinking when he went after her and tried to art her. But other than that, she doesn't really have any interaction with alcohol at all, other than Chase carries around beers. I want to know more about Kaya. We called her Kate yet. And I want to know more about her relationships and how she is in her relationships, because we've established that she loves especially Tate. But I took until we figured out that she was ambivalent about Chase. I took the same love she had for Tate as she did for Chase until she said, "I don't know how I feel about it." But then that never gets addressed again. So I want to understand. I want to have a better understanding of her relationships, and so I mean, I get it. It's tricky because you don't want to give away all your hand. In that there is this grand plan that she ends up coming out with, I guess, after her home is trashed. So not even that far ahead of time to to delete Chase, but we know she likes animals. We know she likes flowers. We know she likes the marsh. We know she doesn't like being around people, and we know she doesn't like to be abandoned, even though she likes being around people. Which is a great. The fact that she doesn't like being abandoned, but she doesn't like being around people, is a great sort of complicated character affectation because it's inherently contradictory in itself. I like that a lot. Um, but we don't really understand who she is in relationships because, for one, she's only had, I'd say, one and a half. But more importantly, they both went sour for different reasons, and so there was no real lesson from one put upon the other one. We almost got it with her ambivalence, but then we didn't, and then it really became Chase being a monster, and so it was neither here nor there at that point. And then passive versus active characters. Yeah, and the way she gets arrested, she was running, so I guess you'd call that active. But for most of the court scenes, other than the fact that she ran and the fact that she told Tom she didn't want to testify, she was just sitting there. Like, she was by definition passive, which is hard to drive a story. Allergies. But I was running like crazy now. But yeah, she's not active, and she's not active in critical moments. Like the beginning of the story and the end of the story, she's not active until we learn that last piece of information. I think that's working against it, and more importantly, we're not close enough to her emotionally to understand what's going on in her two main relationships that are the bulk of the story. I think that's what it is. I think even if you forgive the just straight up cringe that is these middle sections where she's having romantic scenes, if you ignore the cringe, we're not emotionally close enough to what is going on in her head to really have a good understanding of where she's coming from, where she's going, and where she's going to end up. I think that's what it is. I think we just didn't know, and fair dues. We're not in Tate's head. We're not in Chase's head. But the fact that there's a bunch of voiceover in other spots, I feel like we should have been in Kaya's head. And so, I don't know. Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think we just more time needed to be spent critically in Kaya's head on how she feels about stuff instead of just lying on the beach crying with narration. We need to actually have her make choices that have consequences in those moments because it seems like every time she gets upset, she just lies on the beach and cries, and then like a bird cheers her up, which is true to life in circumstances, but a story does not make because stories need to have a choice has a consequence. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to address here because I think that's really what it is. We don't know enough about Kaya, especially in the middle. Ironically, because so much of the story is voiceover, but more importantly, we don't really understand her choice making process because she doesn't ever demonstrate it, and part of that is hiding the big twist at the end that she was the mastermind and that she really is not only guilty of what she's being accused of, but that she was able to deceive the court by simply just sitting there being quiet. Cool, but at the other end, how much do we even know about this character to begin with? And furthermore, once that reveal happens, that calls everything into question. Was any of this real? Even for Tate's the one that found the shell at the end, and so Tate has to realize now the person he spent the majority of his life with was ostensibly married to her for like 50 years. Didn't know this essential detail in her personality, in her life, and that's going to completely recontextualize his entire life. That's actually a more interesting story at that point, because that now we have a man in the twilight of his life, twilight, ironically. So I keep saying the word twilight. Where at the end points of his life, where the love of his life, the great love of his life, just died after having lived a completely fulfilled life. He's discovered she's had an entirely different life that he was intimately a part of while this other life was happening that he had nothing to do with. That's fascinating. But we didn't get that because we're not in Tate's head. We're just not. Um, so would I have done differently? Yes, I would have spent more time on the scenes that really mattered, which ironically in this script are in the middle. Usually you want the first act and the last act to be absolutely bulletproof in order to have a satisfying setup that sets up expectations that get addressed and a satisfying payoff of all the expectations and all the additional escalations, which more or less has happened. But the problem is the stuff in the middle, we're dealing with somebody who is unreliable. The narration is unreliable, and we're not given any indication that she's unreliable until the very, very, very last moment. You're entering it was all a dream territory. That's really what it is. If you I realize I've been pointing at this thing that you can't even see. When you have the great reveal completely recontextualize the entire story, you run the risk of it was all a dream or if it was all not worth it. Ironically, Twilight did this in the ultimate or penultimate episode of it, where the baby touches Michael Sheen's face and he sees an entire 20-minute long war that was all an imagination, all an imagined dream. Yeah, I mean, maybe that's why I feel so empty. Maybe it's yeah, it feels empty because as much as the subtleties of this story really stuck with me. The storytelling was really great until it wasn't, because literally the in the scene moments of the romantic stuff was just a slog. Let's be honest, a slog and then an R, basically an R. And but short of that, like, it was an interesting story. I liked the core stuff, even though it was very straightforward. I could take or leave the troubled childhood, because every fan, incredible hero has that troubled childhood. Is it absolutely necessary to see every beat of that? Probably not. But when it comes to this intimate understanding of who Kaya as a person is, we didn't get it, and we didn't know we didn't have it until we get to the very end, and we realized that the love of her life, Tate, didn't even know who she was, and that ostensibly his entire relationship with her has been based on an absolutely grave lie that if he had known, he would have made a choice about. So the other thing that I want to address is the fact that this movie in no way tries to indicate Tate was the one that killed Charlie. Is that his name? Chase. See, I'm calling him Charlie because I don't want it to be Chase, because Tate and Chase sound so similar. I think the book probably heavily made the reader believe that obviously Tate killed Chase. Obviously, it was his hat. He had the motive. He was looking out for her. He wanted back in a relationship with her, and she didn't want to be with him because she, had real legit reasons not to be in a relationship with him. So it should have been Tate. But ultimately, the court case was about her. And so as soon as she got exonerated, we're good. And I don't think he was even, other than the fact that he showed up late down the line, I don't even think he was even really part of the court case at all. He certainly didn't testify. So did he do it in the books? I don't know. That's all to say, it's an imperfect movie. And, maybe I'll feel differently about it at some point, but yeah, there's two things going wrong with the middle of the story, and one of them is that the actual scenes of the romantic stuff is dross, I think is a good way to describe it. And the other thing is we just don't know enough about Kaya, because we're not really in her head. We're being told we're in her head, but at the end of the day, nothing she does seems to be a reaction to anything else. And even the stuff that she goes after, it's not inherently important to her because we see the beginning of it and we see the end of it. We don't see her actually make a concerted effort for much anything really, other than the absolutely fantastic scene where she's at Jumpin's negotiating for clams. Why were there not more of those scenes? Because those that you had clear character motivations in both Kaya and Jumpin, and you had the subtext, which was Kaya is terrified, she's alone, and the last thing she can do is tell Jumpin that she's terrified and alone. She cannot do that. So there's a real proper tension there. Yeah, fantastic scene. A complete movie. I don't know. Um, Daisy Edgar Jones absolutely carries this movie on her back. I am devastated by how good of an actor she is, and this was her vehicle. I just wish it was presented a little bit more efficiently. And then, yeah, if you Google the author, um, oof, big old oof on that one. So that's what it is. That's my. We broke it. That's how we break. That's how you break the story. So, um, it's not quite as easy to fix as something like Don't Worry, Darling, because Don't Worry, Darling was just many opportunities for improvement, whereas this, because the source material is a book, and books tend to be longer and bigger than movies. Movies get adapted from books all the time, but you do have to throw out a lot. I think a more 1-to-1 ratio of the writing turning into a script is like a short story, because you only get 90 or 120 minutes in a movie, whereas in a book you get as long as you need, and so they tend to be longer anyway. There also is just like an emotional intimacy level of a book that is really hard to translate, and so this script decided that had to be narration to sort of bridge the gap, because it does seem like the book had very much a lot of the character talking to the audience kind of stuff. It's chunky, it's clunky. There's other ways to do it, but for the sake of what we're doing, that's fine. My only real problem is when it comes down to it, Kai's narration was unreliable by its own nature, and because it wasn't established as unreliable, it's sort of a kick in the teeth at the end when the twist comes, even though the twist is pretty obvious. But it calls into question the reliability of everything else. That's it. That's what I got for you. Anybody can do this. There's no perfect way to do it, but it's just when you have a script, when you have a story that's not working, it can be fixed. And sometimes you just have to explode it out onto a big chart and look at it in the macro. Yeah. So there's my studio notes.